Welcome to Dead Good Stories. We have some disturbing and scary horror stories to help you sleep tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe. Otherwise, lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. The storm towered on the horizon, an ominous, roiling mass of black clouds that consumed the sky with unnatural fury. Captain Jonas Calloway stood firm at the helm of the Black Gull, his weathered face turned toward the gathering tempest. This was no ordinary storm. It had a presence, a sinister weight that hung in the air, pressing down on them. The wind carried a biting chill, unnerving and strange for the season. Even the seasoned men of the crew, Frank, Tom, old Pete, and the brothers, Charlie and Sam, shifted uneasily on the deck, their hardened faces paled by the foreboding that gripped the atmosphere. These men had faced death at sea before, but the menace of this storm stirred a primal fear within them all. As the Black Gull was drawn into the maw of the storm, the sea became a monstrous living thing. Towering waves rose like great walls of water, battering the ship with unrelenting force. The ship creaked and groaned under the assault, each strike from the sea sending shudders through the hull. The wind howled like a pack of ravenous wolves, tearing through the rigging and whipping the sails into tatters. Rain fell in blinding sheets, a wall of water that obscured everything beyond the immediate struggle for survival. Jonas's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel, trying to keep the ship steady, but the ocean fought back, tossing the Black Gull like a toy in its vast, violent grasp. For what felt like an eternity, the men battled the storm. The ship heaved and rolled beneath them, the deck slick with rain and seawater. The crew clung to anything that might offer stability, ropes, masts, the very wood of the deck itself, as the relentless fury of the storm sought to throw them into the churning depths. Lightning split the sky, casting brief, eerie glimpses of the chaos around them, illuminating the terror etched on their faces. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the storm's fury abated. The Black Gull drifted into an uncanny stillness. The sea, which had moments before been a wrathful beast, was now eerily calm, its surface as smooth as polished glass. The winds fell silent, and the rain ceased. A deep, unnatural quiet settled over the ship, broken only by the faint rumble of thunder in the distance. The men, drenched and exhausted, stared out into the surrounding black walls of the storm, now a perfect circle around them. They had entered the eye. The air in the eye of the storm was heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. And then, out of the thick mist ahead, a shape emerged. At first it was nothing more than a faint shadow, but as the ship drifted closer, the form solidified. A massive ship, larger than anything Jonas or his crew had ever seen. Its white hull gleamed faintly in the dim, muted light, ghostly against the storm's dark backdrop. The vessel was grand, almost regal, with towering smokestacks and intricate wooden carvings adorning its railings. It was a ship out of time, its design unmistakably Victorian, as if it had sailed straight out of the past. As the mist parted, the name on the ship's bow became visible. The Britannia. The crew stood frozen in disbelief. The sight of the Britannia was wrong, utterly out of place, a relic from a long-forgotten age, adrift in the heart of a supernatural storm. Yet there it was, pristine, untouched by the chaos that had engulfed the sea around them. There was no sign of life on board, no movement, no sound. The silence that surrounded it was thick, unnatural, as though time itself had stopped. Despite the foreboding sense of wrongness, a pull of curiosity, and perhaps a darker compulsion, urged Jonas and his men toward the vessel. They lowered the lifeboat into the glassy sea and rowed toward the Britannia, their oars cutting through the water with soft, rhythmic splashes. As they approached, the ship loomed larger and more ominous, its silence pressing down on them like a weight. When they finally boarded, the deck creaked beneath their feet, slick with mist. Everything on the ship was intact, perfectly preserved. The wooden railings gleamed, the polished floors were undisturbed, and the ornate carvings were as sharp and detailed as the day they had been crafted. Yet there was something profoundly wrong. The air itself seemed to hum with a strange energy, as though the ship was aware of their presence. The crew split up, their footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness as they explored the ship's grand corridors. Jonas led the way, his boots thudding softly on the fine wooden floors. Every room they passed was a study in opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, their facets catching the dim light, and lavish furnishings filled the space. The grand dining hall was set for a feast, plates and cutlery arranged neatly, untouched by time or decay. And yet, despite the ship's pristine condition, there was an overwhelming sense of abandonment. Dust hung in the air, and every breath felt thick, as if the ship had been waiting for something or someone. Deeper into the ship they ventured, until a faint, haunting melody reached their ears. It was a waltz, soft and distant, as though played from a long-forgotten gramophone. The music was beautiful, yet unsettling in its timelessness. Drawn by the sound, they followed the winding corridors until they reached a set of grand double doors. Pushing them open, they entered the ballroom. Inside, the impossible greeted them. The ballroom was filled with people, all dressed in the finery of another era. Men in black suits with slicked-back hair, and women in elegant Victorian gowns swirled across the floor, dancing in perfect time to the ghostly waltz. Their movements were graceful, but unnervingly slow, as though they were caught in the drag of time itself. The air was thick with the scent of old perfume, mingled with the faint odor of decay. Jonas and his crew stood frozen, hearts hammering in their chests. The dancers seemed real, solid even, but there was something horribly wrong about them. Their faces were pale, their smiles too wide, too fixed. Their eyes, though open, were empty, hollow voids that saw nothing and everything all at once. They moved with a mechanical grace, their bodies swaying in rhythm, but there was no life in them. They were echoes, shadows of people long dead. As the men stood paralyzed, the dancers' movements began to slow, their hollow eyes shifting to fix on the intruders. The atmosphere in the room grew oppressive, the air thickening with a malevolent energy. The once graceful dancers now moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their eyes never leaving Jonas and his crew. The music, once beautiful, twisted into a discordant, haunting dirge, a mockery of its former melody. Panic seized the men as the dancers began to advance, their faces twisted into grotesque mockeries of smiles. The temperature in the room plummeted, the cold biting deep into their bones. Jonas and his crew, driven by a primal fear, turned and fled, racing through the ship's endless halls, the ghostly waltz pursuing them like a relentless specter. When they burst back onto the deck, the storm had returned with a vengeance. Waves crashed against the Britannia, and the lifeboat they had arrived in was gone, smashed to pieces. Above, the storm raged, its winds howling and tearing at the ship. And as Jonas looked back at the ballroom, he saw the figures from within now gathered on the deck, their empty eyes watching in eerie silence. They were no longer intruders on the Britannia. They were its prisoners, bound to the ship as it drifted forever through the storm, lost to time, lost to life. The Wilson family had eagerly anticipated their Caribbean cruise aboard the Pacific Horizon. It was to be a week of relaxation, fun, and reconnection. For months, Brian and Julia Wilson had juggled demanding jobs, while their children, Lucy and Max, had been consumed by school and activities. The cruise promised a break from all that, a chance to reset and enjoy life together as a family. The first few days were idyllic. The ship sailed smoothly across sapphire waters, the sky a brilliant blue with only wisps of clouds drifting overhead. Lucy and Max delighted in the pools and arcade, their laughter carrying through the ship's halls. Brian and Julia found solace in quiet moments on deck, sipping cocktails as the sun set in blazing hues of orange and pink. It felt like the perfect escape. But on the fourth day, everything changed. Late that afternoon, a warning came from the captain. A storm was approaching, and though it would bring heavy winds and rain, the Pacific Horizon was built to withstand such weather. passengers were advised to stay inside for the evening. As the sun disappeared behind thickening clouds, the first gusts of wind began to buffet the ship, and rain spattered against the windows. By nightfall, the storm had escalated into something far more terrifying. The ship groaned as massive waves slammed into its sides, pitching and rolling it violently. The wind howled like a beast in the night, and the rain became a relentless assault, hammering the ship with the fury of the ocean. Inside their cabin, Brian and Julia huddled with Lucy and Max, the fear they tried to mask creeping into their voices and movements. The ship shuddered with each new wave, the lights flickering ominously as the storm intensified. As the hours wore on, the ship seemed to fight for its life against the raging sea. Deep, resonant groans reverberated through the walls, as though the very structure of the vessel was being tested. Objects slid across the floor with each lurch, and outside the shrill sounds of alarms and distant crashes punctuated the howling wind. Suddenly the lights went out. The cabin was plunged into total darkness. Panic surged through the family. Brian scrambled to find his phone, its faint glow barely illuminating their faces. The ship listed to one side, throwing them against the walls. Water began to seep under the door, cold and insistent, as if the storm were trying to claw its way inside. With mounting urgency, Brian led his family out of the cabin and into the hallway, where emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie red glow. The corridor was a scene of chaos. Water sloshed at their feet, and the walls creaked with every groan of the ship. Passengers streamed past them in a frantic rush, eyes wide with fear, some shouting that the ship was sinking. The air was thick with panic, an unspoken understanding that something had gone terribly wrong. The Wilsons joined the tide of people, making their way toward the stairwell that led to the upper decks and lifeboats. The ship's tilt had grown more pronounced, making every step a struggle. The metal steps were slick with rainwater, and passengers slipped and stumbled as they climbed toward what they hoped was safety. As they reached the open deck, they were met with a nightmare vision. The storm had transformed the sky into a swirling mass of black clouds, illuminated by flashes of lightning. The wind tore at their clothes, and rain lashed at their skin with the sting of needles. But it was the ocean that filled Brian with dread. An enormous wall of water, taller than any building he had ever seen, rising out of the sea like a monstrous hand poised to crush the ship. In that moment, time seemed to stop. The wave loomed impossibly large, its dark surface churning and frothing, a towering force of nature that defied comprehension. It was unstoppable, an elemental force that dwarfed the Pacific horizon and everyone aboard. Then the wave hit. The impact was catastrophic. The ship heaved violently to one side as the wave crashed down upon it, the deck buckling under the weight of the water. Brian felt himself thrown through the air, losing his grip on Max as they tumbled across the slick surface. For a brief moment he was submerged in freezing water, disoriented and gasping for breath. When he surfaced, the deck was unrecognizable. Lifeboats that had once hung securely were now shattered wrecks, torn from their moorings by the force of the wave. Passengers screamed as they clung to whatever they could find, their bodies battered by the relentless storm. The ship groaned deeply, as if it were surrendering to the ocean's fury. Brian's heart raced as he searched for his family. He spotted Julia and Lucy, barely hanging onto the remains of a broken railing. Their faces were masks of terror, their knuckles white as they struggled against the torrent of rain and wind. But Max, where was Max? Another wave, smaller but no less dangerous, was building in the distance, and the ship continued to tilt dangerously toward the sea. Brian fought his way toward Julia and Lucy, slipping on the water-soaked deck, his muscles aching from the cold. He was almost to them when the ship lurched again, harder this time. The railing they clung to gave way. He saw it happen in agonizing detail. Julia and Lucy slipping into the black water, their screams drowned out by the storm. He lunged for them, but the sea had already claimed them, pulling them into its depths. Brian collapsed onto the deck, numb with horror and grief. His family was gone. The storm raged on, uncaring, as the ship continued its slow descent into the abyss. The ocean, vast and unyielding, was everywhere, swallowing everything in its path. He tried to move, to search for Max, but his body felt heavy, his limbs like lead. The freezing water rose higher around him, its icy grip pulling him down as the ship sank deeper into the unforgiving sea. As the darkness closed in, Brian's last thoughts were of his family, the laughter, the love, the life they had shared. The storm had taken it all. The sea, cold and black, claimed him next, its depths swallowing him whole. And then there was nothing but silence, as the Pacific horizon disappeared beneath the waves. The gentle sway of the ship had always been a lullaby for Mia, coaxing her into deep, dreamless sleep. But tonight was different. She woke abruptly, drenched in sweat, her skin clammy and her heart pounding. The room, though chilled by the hum of the air conditioner, felt stifling, as if the very air had thickened. A headache pulsed behind her eyes, and her throat felt as dry as sandpaper. Something was wrong. Ethan's side of the bed was cold, his absence registering in her dazed state as unsettling. It wasn't like him to leave without a word. The familiar sounds of the ship, the hum of activity from beyond the cabin door, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the buzz of conversation, were gone. In their place was an eerie, deafening silence. Mia threw off the sheets and stumbled to her feet, pulling on her robe with shaking hands. The moment she stepped into the hallway, the oppressive quiet hit her, like walking into a void. The ship, which had been alive with the movements and voices of hundreds of passengers, now felt like a tomb. Every hallway she passed through was empty, the once bustling lounges and stairwells abandoned. Trays of food sat uneaten, chairs sat askew, and drinks had melted into untouched pools of condensation. A creeping sense of isolation wrapped around her. She hurried through the ship, moving faster as her sense of dread grew. The emptiness was everywhere. She reached the main deck, her footsteps echoing unnervingly loud, but found no one. She searched the lounge, the dining area, even the poolside, where once there had been throngs of people. The silence seemed to swell around her, as if the ship itself had swallowed its passengers whole. At the captain's quarters, she hammered on the door, but there was no answer. Pushing it open, she found the bridge completely deserted. The ship's controls blinked and flickered quietly in the dim light, maintaining their course. Yet there was no one to steer. The windows ahead revealed nothing but a flat, endless stretch of ocean. The horizon a hazy blur between sky and sea. The water was unnaturally calm, a glassy expanse that stretched on forever, devoid of life or movement. It was as though the world beyond the ship had ceased to exist. Her panic mounted as the hours dragged on. The stillness pressed against her, thickening the air until it was suffocating. By the time the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the deserted decks, Mia had wandered the ship aimlessly, her mind spinning in an endless loop of confusion and dread. She called out for Ethan, for anyone, her voice swallowed by the vastness of the ship. The silence was so heavy it seemed alive, suffocating her with its weight. As night fell, her fever intensified. She lay curled in the cabin, soaked in sweat, trembling as whispers began to fill the room. Faint, distorted voices carried on the air. Shadows darted in the corners of her vision, but each time she turned, there was nothing. Her thoughts raced, fraying at the edges, as if something dark and insidious had taken root in her mind. Exhaustion finally claimed her, and she slipped into a restless sleep, plagued by chaotic dreams. When Mia awoke, she found herself sprawled on the floor of the dining hall, surrounded by shattered dishes and overturned tables. Her head throbbed with a dull ache, and her robe was torn, her arms scratched and bruised. She sat up slowly, confusion settling over her like a fog. The room was in chaos, plates scattered, chairs upended, food smeared across the floor. Glass crunched beneath her feet as she struggled to stand. Had there been a struggle? Her memories were fragmented, disjointed. She remembered wandering through the ship, frantic, but beyond that the night was a blur of fevered disorientation. As she tried to piece together what had happened, a cold realization crept in. She had done this. The destruction, the broken glass, the overturned tables, it was her doing. In her fevered haze, she had rampaged through the ship, her body acting without her conscious mind. A wave of nausea rolled through her as the enormity of it sunk in. But then, where was everyone? Where was Ethan? Her breath came in ragged gasps as she bolted out of the dining hall, running through the ship in a blind panic. Every room, every deck was the same: destruction, chaos. The signs of her fevered madness were everywhere, as if she had torn through the ship like a storm, leaving nothing untouched. She reached the pool deck and collapsed to her knees, staring out at the vast, still ocean. The sky had darkened with thick, low clouds, casting the world in a heavy, oppressive gray. The sea below was unnervingly calm, reflecting the ominous sky like a black mirror. She felt the weight of it pressing down on her, the hopelessness of being truly alone. But then, from behind her, came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. Mia's heart leapt into her throat. She turned slowly, dread curling in her stomach, and saw Ethan standing there. His face was pale, drawn tight with exhaustion. His eyes were sunken, his clothes dirty and disheveled, as though he had been hiding for days. He looked at her, but there was no warmth in his gaze, only a hollow sorrow that twisted her insides. Her fevered mind had twisted the ship into an empty wasteland, a prison of her own creation. In her madness, she had driven everyone away. She wasn't abandoned. She had been the one to push them into hiding. She had been lost, consumed by the fever, unable to see what was real anymore. The ship hadn't been silent. It hadn't been empty. She had been the storm all along. The getaway was supposed to be perfect. The cruise liner, Elysium, was an enormous floating city, designed for luxury and relaxation. It boasted sprawling pools, endless buffets, and entertainment that stretched late into the night. The sea extended in every direction, an endless expanse of blue beneath a cloudless sky. Boarding the ship with my girlfriend Sarah was meant to be an escape from the pressures of everyday life. For the first few days, it was just that: sunbathing, sipping fruity cocktails, and dancing into the early hours. But everything changed on the fourth night. It started subtly. The ocean, once calm and inviting, grew eerily still. The comforting sway of the ship ceased, as if the water had frozen, trapping the vessel in place. Staring into the night sea, a feeling of unease crept in, as though something ancient and malevolent lurked just beneath the surface. Around midnight, a strange sound disturbed the quiet, a rhythmic knocking, like fingers tapping lightly against metal. The sea outside remained unnervingly calm, reflecting the starry sky, but the knocking persisted, growing closer, more insistent. Peering over the railing into the water below, a sense of dread washed over me. Something was down there. At first glance, it appeared to be a school of fish gliding beneath the surface, but their movements were too smooth, too deliberate. Long, slender shapes, almost serpentine, glistened under the moonlight before disappearing just as quickly as they had appeared. The following morning, the crew's behavior shifted. They were quieter, more tense, with nervous glances cast toward the horizon. At breakfast, whispers of the silence below floated through the air, but any inquiries were met with cold silence. Despite Sarah's reassurances, an inescapable sense of wrongness hung in the air. That night the tapping returned, louder and closer. The same serpentine shapes reappeared, circling the ship in a slow, deliberate pattern as if studying it. Then, without warning, the water erupted. A massive, scaled figure emerged from the depths, towering over the ship, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Its gaping mouth, filled with rows of needle-like teeth, loomed for a brief, terrifying moment before plunging back into the sea with a deafening splash. The atmosphere on board became tense the next morning. Passengers whispered in frightened groups, some sharing glimpses of the same horror seen in the night. The captain's strained voice over the loudspeaker offered reassurances, but the unease only deepened. By nightfall, the ship had stopped moving. No explanation was given as the vessel floated, dead in the water. Panic spread as people gathered on the upper decks demanding answers, but the crew remained silent, their faces pale and drawn. Then the screaming began. From the lower decks, waves of terror echoed as one by one people began to vanish without a trace. Shadows moved through the halls and voices called from the water. As the tapping grew louder and more frantic, the ship became a nightmarish maze. Doors led to nowhere, twisting in on themselves. Shadows followed, growing darker and more tangible with each step. Something slithered in the walls, and the ship groaned under its weight. Reaching the deck at last, the sea churned violently below, but it wasn't the wind or waves causing the disturbance. Dozens of serpentine shapes were rising from the depths, their glowing eyes fixed on the ship. The crew's desperate attempts to fight back were futile. The creatures, whatever they were, had surrounded the ship. A deep, guttural voice echoed from below, vibrating through the very structure of the ship. It spoke of hunger, vengeance, and something older than humanity itself. In a moment of terror, Sarah was yanked from my side, dragged toward the railing by something cold and slick. Despite my frantic attempts to hold on, she was pulled overboard, her terrified face vanishing beneath the black water. Now, silence reigns. The ship is deserted, adrift in the endless sea. Though the tapping has stopped, a lingering sense of dread remains. They are still out there, waiting for me. The Odyssey was the pinnacle of luxury cruising, a floating city that promised its passengers a paradise of indulgence, relaxation, and escape. Stretching over 1,000 feet long, it was filled with five-star restaurants, spas, swimming pools, and theaters. It carried thousands of guests who sought an oasis on the vast open sea, far from the noise and chaos of the mainland. But by the fourth night of the voyage, a subtle yet pervasive unease had begun to settle in. It started innocuously enough, a persistent feeling of being watched. Guests complained of strange sensations as they walked down the brightly lit corridors. They felt eyes on them in their rooms, an unsettling prickling at the back of their necks as though someone, or something, was lurking just beyond their peripheral vision. Some attributed it to paranoia, others to too many cocktails on the upper decks, but none could deny the weight of dread that seemed to hang in the air. That same night, a man was found dead in his cabin. His body was seated in a chair, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the wall. There were no signs of struggle, no injuries. The cause of death was unclear, but what struck the crew as strange was the expression on his face, a look of sheer terror, frozen in place. The doctor on board ruled it a heart attack, but whispers of something more sinister spread quickly among the passengers. As the days passed, the ship's atmosphere became increasingly oppressive. What began as small complaints, lights flickering, strange knocking sounds in the walls, items going missing, soon escalated. Passengers claimed they heard footsteps in the hallways late at night, heavy and deliberate, though no one was ever seen. Some reported seeing shadowy figures in their rooms or the reflection of someone standing behind them in mirrors, only to turn around and find no one there. The crew did their best to maintain order, but their smiles were strained, their reassurances hollow. They, too, had begun to experience the unsettling phenomena. Crew members would disappear briefly, only to reappear in parts of the ship they had no memory of traveling to, disoriented and confused. The ship's state-of-the-art navigation system began to malfunction. Despite clear skies and calm seas, the Odyssey's course seemed to drift ever so slightly, steering the ship into an unfamiliar stretch of ocean. No one could explain why. Then came the blackouts. At first they lasted only a few seconds, a brief flicker of the lights before everything returned to normal. But the durations began to lengthen. During these periods of total darkness, the ship was engulfed in an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creaking of the hull or the distant splash of waves. Passengers huddled together in their cabins, clutching at flashlights or anything that would chase away the oppressive blackness. Some swore they could hear voices during the blackouts, soft murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. As the blackouts grew longer, so did the terror. During one prolonged period of darkness, when the lights finally flickered back on, nearly 100 passengers were missing. Their rooms were empty, their personal belongings left behind, beds unmade as if they had simply vanished. Panic spread quickly. The ship's crew scoured every inch of the vessel, but there was no trace of the missing. Not even the security cameras captured anything, just static. as though the ship itself had swallowed them whole. Desperation set in. Some passengers tried to signal for help, but all communication with the outside world had mysteriously cut off. The Odyssey was utterly isolated, adrift in a sea that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The once vibrant and festive atmosphere had descended into chaos. People barricaded themselves in their rooms, refusing to leave, while others wandered the empty corridors in a daze, calling out the names of their loved ones who had disappeared. Then, without warning, the ship stopped. Not slowly, not with the gradual deceleration one would expect from such a massive vessel. It simply stopped, as if it had collided with an invisible wall. The engines, which had been a constant hum in the background, fell silent. The water around the Odyssey became unnervingly calm, almost as if the ocean itself had stilled. It was then that the real horror began. Passengers who ventured out on deck to see what had happened reported a change in the water. It was no longer the deep blue of the ocean they had been sailing through. It had turned black, like ink, and thick tendrils of mist began to rise from its surface, curling and twisting in unnatural patterns. The mist clung to the ship, seeping through cracks in doors and windows, filling the halls with an icy chill. As the fog thickened, passengers began to hear it, the scraping. It sounded like fingernails, clawing at the ship's hull from beneath the water. Slow, deliberate scrapes that sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it. The noise grew louder, more insistent, until it reverberated through the metal walls. And then, the walls themselves began to change. The once pristine, polished surfaces started to warp. Small dents appeared at first, but they grew larger with each passing minute, as though something was pushing from the other side, trying to break through. The dents became bulges, and soon the entire ship seemed to be writhing, the very structure buckling under an unseen pressure. From the heart of the ship, the engine room where the crew had lost contact hours earlier, a low, guttural moan began to rise. It was a sound unlike anything human, a deep, resonant wail that echoed through every corridor, every cabin. The sound stirred something in the fog, which now poured into the ship with greater force, as if drawn by the unearthly call. Passengers who were still conscious witnessed the mist solidify into forms, dark, elongated figures that slipped through the hallways, silent and deliberate. These figures moved with impossible grace, their limbs long and twisted, faces obscured by the fog. They drifted through walls, gliding effortlessly toward the terrified passengers. Those who encountered the figures found themselves paralyzed, unable to move, as the creatures passed by them, whispering unintelligible words that froze the very air around them. By dawn, there were only a handful of survivors left. They gathered on the upper deck, staring out at the blackened ocean and the still, featureless horizon. The fog had receded slightly, but the ship was no longer recognizable. The walls had twisted and buckled inward, the decks cracked and splintered. The grand vessel that had once promised luxury and escape had been transformed into a decaying husk, a prison of warped steel and rotting wood. The survivors, gaunt and hollow-eyed, realized the truth too late. The Odyssey wasn't adrift in any earthly sea. It had crossed over into something else, a place beyond time, beyond reality, and whatever had claimed the ship wasn't done with them yet. The fog began to rise again. The figures returned, this time moving with purpose, their twisted forms growing clearer in the dim light of the dying sun. The last remaining passengers stood frozen, unable to run, as the shadows closed in. The Odyssey continued its eternal voyage, lost in a sea that no map could chart, a ship forever bound to the dark waters of the unknown.